party, that they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary. And you're going to have to keep on saying that. You're going to have to say that I am a proletarian. I am the people. I'm not the pig. You've got to make a distinction. And the people are going to have to attack the pigs. The people are going to have to stand up against the pigs.
Welcome to Blueprints of Disruption, a podcast dedicated to building our capacity for resistance. My name is Justin McLean, and I'll be your host for today's episode. That was Black Panther Fred Hampton you heard in the intro talking about pushing up against police. And as we push up against various systems of oppression, we are facing fierce opposition using an equally wide array of tactics. And one of those is the weaponization of criminal law against any form of protest. Last week's episode was with a member of the Orange Hats, legal observers in Toronto, reporting on the many ways in which police are trying to suppress actions on the ground and intimidate activists. This week, we're going to look at the other side of arrests and police targeting, the malicious prosecution of Palestinian solidarity activists, and the political interference that spearheads it all. Arash and Nora are both movement lawyers, a distinction explained in the episode, and they're here to flag some very troubling trends indeed. Most of them coming from inside the Ontario Attorney General's office and that hate crime working group we have mentioned in the past. But true to fashion, we are also going to learn some of the ways folks are disrupting these efforts. Because the good news is, and you can see this is true for yourself, despite the increasingly heavy hand being deployed against various movements, no one has been deterred. A contributing factor to that steadfastness are the legal support groups that have rallied around those most impacted by the criminalization of dissent, particularly those trying to end the occupation of Palestine. So let's find out more about these lawyers and the work that they do, not just keeping our comrades out of jail, but in protecting the movement as a whole. Welcome. Please introduce yourself.
So I'm Nora Fathalipour. Among other things, I'm a lawyer. I primarily practice in criminal defense. I do consider myself a movement lawyer. I practice on my own right now. I'm a sole practitioner, and that has given me the freedom and flexibility to take on the work that I care about, which I think is, part of the reason why I'm here today. And I'm really looking forward to discussing some topics that I think we all care about. And I can tell you I'm a frequent listener of the podcast. So.
Oh, I'm gushing. Thank you, Nora. That's awesome. So, we've been in this before. We're kind of teasing the audience, but let's let Arash introduce himself before we tell people why you're here.
Hello. My name is Arash Ghiassi. I am also a criminal defense lawyer. I've also been a member of the Movement Defense Committee, which is an organization that's based in Toronto and has been providing legal supports to movements and protesters for many years now. I'm not here on any official capacity on behalf of the MDC, but I have represented folks who are charged in relation to protest for a few years. I have other cases too, but that's something that I'm really passionate about.
I went through both of your bios while I was waiting for you to join me, and they're not your typical lawyer bios. I don't know if you folks know that. I'm sure you do. So, Arash, I'm going through yours first, and it's first or second paragraph right there. It's like it says, he feels the legal system is a place of injustice. I agree. I think there's a lot of people that could agree, but I don't think that, when they're surfing looking for a lawyer, that they're used to getting such a candid bio. And then Nora talks all about power imbalances throughout her bio, how that's like one of your goals is to rectify as much as possible the power balances that exist. So, reading through these bios, I know you're my people already, and I've heard such wonderful things about the work that you're doing, but especially how you engage with your clients. So I'll just say that, but we aren't going to get into specifics on many clients, but I imagine you folks, you have your hands full. Would you both consider yourself movement lawyers?
I think I would. I know Nora said that she does as well. To me, that means practicing law, especially when the clients are part of a movement that respects their commitment to that movement. Sometimes that means practicing law in a way that doesn't narrowly focus on an individual client's interests defined very individualistically, as the legal system typically does, but their interest also in making a political point or contributing to a movement. Now, that doesn't mean that I forget about all legal risks. I still have my role to advise my clients about legal risks, but I don't do it in a way that disempowers the client from making an informed decision on their own about what risks to take.
Yeah, and to Arash's point, I think I agree with everything he says. And I think the interesting thing about the difference between clients who are involved in the movement versus maybe some traditional clients is having the open-minded and flexible approach to ask them, what are you actually trying to achieve here? What are your goals? And not assuming that they may be the traditional goals of someone else who's arrested and is in the criminal justice system.
Did they teach you how to do this in law school? This tightrope that you essentially have to walk between, not doing any damage to your client or the movement, and, because how lawyers are typically portrayed, let's say in the media or movies, like we'll go there, is, very focused on a win, a victory. It has a very clear definition of what that is. And it's like, get your client off, get them to face no repercussions, no matter who you have to throw under the bus or whatnot. But these people aren't facing charges under normal circumstances. To think that they might have other goals than just remaining free or without as many consequences as possible is probably not experienced by other lawyers. Do you find people are refreshingly surprised that you get it? That you get that there are bigger things at play?
I think for me, it's also a learning process. Arash has done this longer than I have. And to answer your original question, no, we do not learn this in law school. So it is, in some ways, an iterative process where I am, moving through thinking about this along with my clients, and then maybe consulting with other people and thinking about how to achieve certain goals. So I think I've had positive feedback about that approach, but, I'm also still learning, right? And every person is going to be different and their needs are going to be different. So I've been very positively surprised, I will say, by how much it has enhanced my own practice and how enjoyable it is to think broadly and deeply about how these cases not just affect my clients' lives, but, what's going to be the potential impact of this going down the road. So that's been really rewarding for me personally.
It's interesting, Jessa, you mentioned a narrow focus on wanting to be free. I think sometimes clients feel like they're being restricted and unfree and muzzled by their own lawyers, right? So during the process. So I think it's important to understand what that desire for freedom is, and that it's not limited to what a judge will impose on you. It's also what the process is designed to impose on you, which involves separating you from your community. Sometimes there are no association conditions that prevent you from associating with other members of the community or people who are your comrades, and to create these conditions where you will stop what the system deems to be an offense, right? And so I think when we work through that, we are trying to also preserve our clients' freedom throughout the process. And I'll tell you, movement lawyering is a marginalized but storied tradition within the legal profession. It's not something that only arose yesterday. There are papers written about movement lawyering. There's a tradition. There are organizations that have been doing that in the US, in Canada. And I was actually very lucky in that I did have a course in my law school. It was a seminar course, and it was about movement lawyering, or relationship between the lawyers and movements. And I really liked that. It was small. It was only a handful of students in that course, but I did learn a lot.
Was that at Yale?
It was, yes.
It would have been bigger maybe if you had a different university, but it's interesting. I wonder if you could reflect on your notes from that class and the way things have changed. Because I imagine even if as Nora's learning it, it's very fluid. It's not even that maybe you haven't been doing it as long as Arash. It's like it has been around for a long time, but I imagine that the role has not been the same, and what you're facing has not been the same. We've told a lot of stories here on Blueprints of Disruption of activists facing harsh bail conditions, harassment, and increased surveillance by the police. We've talked about the door knocking, the delayed charges, where, months will go by and you think it was just some innocent action, and then you start getting harassed by the police for it or picked up for it. And we've also talked a little bit about Project Resolute. For folks who are like, no, I wasn't here for that. I will link related episodes in the show notes like I do. So, because we can't cover all of that while we have Nora and Arash here. But I'm wondering if you folks can speak to the trends that have been happening over the past, perhaps, year. And I think specifically here in Ontario around the Attorney General's office and Project Resolute, and how these pressures maybe change the cases that you're facing now.
Yeah, so what's interesting, I think, is, looking at how police have essentially used movement actions in the past couple of years to continue to advocate for a bloated budget. I think you can see how, whether it's Project Resolute or other specific aspects of police, what we've seen is over the last year and a bit, the police response has been quite aggressive. And it appears to have the support of our local politicians. And in fact, I'm sure many people think police aren't doing enough, especially given how determined activists have been to make sure that people do not forget about the genocide in Palestine. I'm sure yourself and your listeners know about the hate crime unit, for example, in the Toronto police. And one very interesting example is, the hate crime unit has existed before Palestine was back into focus and before this recent genocide began. But we know that the hate crime unit was incredibly small in the Toronto police. Now we have, at least 30 officers involved. And in fact, the mayor of Toronto essentially demanded of Toronto police to answer questions about what are you doing to address, what city councillors were calling the rise of hate crimes, right? And that's not to say that we haven't had legitimate incidents that perhaps are hate crimes, right? Like that does happen in our city.
But that's not what they mean.
But that's not what they mean. Yes, exactly. So what's happening is what we've seen is not only has the hate crime unit within the Toronto police increased in man size, but their entire mandate was expanded, right? Like now any action or protest that may have a connection with, the Middle East, or as people like to call it, the conflict in the Middle East, they automatically fall under the hate crime unit's mandate now. They get these so-called expert police officers to oversee and make sure that these cases and charges are on track. And so, there's many things that can be said about that. But, one thing I want to make very clear is that I think that, labeling any sort of citizen action that may or may not be related to Palestine, to me, sounds like there's some anti-Palestinian racism here at play, right? Like, why would we automatically think that someone is hateful because they're involved in a protest related to Palestine? And so that is a very concerning trend that I think we've noticed. And I don't think we have clear answers. I don't think we actually have clear answers as to why is the hate crime unit involved if someone is protesting genocide?
Well, you're sort of being facetious, right? I imagine you know that there's an ulterior motive to criminalize and demonize the Palestinian solidarity movement. And just being able to say, with honesty, that they're all being investigated for hate crimes, right? Not whether they're charged or whether there's any validity in the investigation, but then they can also say all of these evil, evil people that are taking to the streets every week that we need to control better, they are also being investigated for hate crimes, which is so damaging to these people, right? Have you actually had a client charged with hate crimes?
I personally have not. I have seen many people who have been charged with, what we'd call just general offenses, that we'd see in other cases. But then, like you said, the police will announce that, by the way, we suspect this is a hate crime, right? And there's the language of hate crimes. And to provide a little bit further context, the way people are charged in the province of Ontario can be a little bit different from other jurisdictions. So what we have is the police actually decide whether or not to lay charges against a person. They have that discretion normally. So traditionally, the police will, investigate and then decide, are we going to lay charges? What kind of charges? And so on. There are specific offenses in the criminal code that are hate crime offenses. Most of those actually require the consent of the Attorney General to even lay. And so they actually fall outside the traditional charging model that we have in Ontario, where the police just have the discretion to lay the charges, right? So I have not personally seen cases where they have managed to get the consent of the Attorney General to lay an actual hate crime charge, although I'm aware it has happened a few times. And I think Arash knows more about that. But essentially, it's the police's discretion. What they do is they know they haven't charged that person with a hate crime. The cloud of the language of hate crime will hang over that individual. And then if that individual is ultimately convicted or found guilty of an offense, the Crown may choose to try to prove that there were hateful circumstances that contributed to the offense, and that could obviously be very aggravating and negative. And then the judge essentially decides, is there evidence of that? But in many of these cases, what we see is that the language of hate crime is attached immediately. Someone is arrested, the Toronto police issues some sort of media statement about it, and the language of hate crime is attached immediately. So what actually happens down the road can look very different from what it starts out with. But yes, like you said, that carries a huge amount of stigma and stress for people, very understandably so.
And from what I'm understanding, it can have legal repercussions even without that hate crime charge.
Absolutely.
So it's interesting. So what the police are doing is using hate crime really as a PR tactic. They know that they can't, it's actually not their job to determine whether the charge is a hate crime or not. It's either, as Nora mentioned, the Attorney General's call, or later down the line, it's the judge's call. So it's actually nothing official they're doing has to do with hate crime, but they insinuate this in their press releases in a way that's very, I would say, misleading. So first of all, they'll say these individuals are being investigated by the hate crime unit. So they're automatically branded with a tar of a potential hate crime just because of the name of the unit that is investigating them, even if that unit never makes the allegation that there has been a crime or that the crime has been hate motivated. And then they say, because the Attorney General has to consent, if you look at all these press releases, they all have this addendum to it that says, well, more hate crimes may be coming later if we get the Attorney General's consent. And that never happens. And then there's this business of potentially hate motivated. Look, every crime can be potentially hate motivated. That is a question that gets addressed at the tail end, at the end of the process, when a court reflects on the case and decides whether the sentence should include a premium for being hate motivated. And none of these cases so far have resulted in that. So it's just a disingenuous way of trying to tar the movement with a hate element that is not even in their mandate to do. The one thing Nora mentioned about a couple of instances of actual hate crimes being alleged, it's interesting. So one of them was very highly publicized. It was the case of an individual who was charged with willful promotion of hatred, for publicly inciting hatred, for waving the flag of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a Marxist-Leninist party in Palestine and has been designated in Canada as a terrorist organization. In spite of that, doing that is actually not the same as publicly inciting hatred. And so 3 months later, the Crown had to withdraw that charge because, according to the Crown itself, there was no reasonable prospect of conviction. And at the same time, the Crown doesn't want to quite admit that. So on the record, in court, the Crown says, police legitimately were concerned about the flag, that it could incite hatred towards Jewish people, and that Torontonians should be put on notice that flying the flag may well be met with further arrests. On what basis? If it wasn't a hate crime in one case, why is it it could be in another case? So it's just an attempt to silence legitimate protest.
Which brings me back to that point where you talked about some people feeling muzzled by their lawyers on top of the conditions that they have. And any activist listening will understand that's them winning. Not only is it torture for an organizer or an activist, people who are out there to think of they can't use their voice in this moment, but it's the goal, right? So it's absolutely critical that folks still be able to retain a voice and work as a collective. Those bail conditions are, go tie in with all of the other tactics being used to just kind of drive wedges and exhaust people. You mentioned a charge is being withdrawn, and I'm sure that client or that person is very relieved. And I guess as lawyers, perhaps you feel like you've done your job when that happens, but can you talk a little bit about the impact going through court has, even when charges are dropped?
Yeah, I think many of us use this language of process as punishment. In many of these cases, when it comes to organizers and activists being charged or arrested, what they're ultimately charged with tend to be extremely low-level offenses, right? Like very, very low level, like mischief, broad things that have to do with, did you do a little bit of damage to property, things like that. And so it's not actually likely that they're going to go to jail, right? Like jail is reserved for the most serious offenses, but having that charge hanging over your head is quite impactful. Many people don't know that when you're charged with an offense, it can take a little bit of while for it to go through the system, even to get ultimately to a point where perhaps the charges are withdrawn, right? So during that time, you're on bail conditions or release conditions, which may say that you can't communicate with certain people. You have to stay away from a certain location that is, related to where you were arrested, of what you're accused of. And so during that time, even if your charges ultimately get withdrawn, you do have that cloud hanging over your head of, I could potentially be breaching, or what happens if I talk about it. People are quite cognizant of, not wanting to hurt the movement, not wanting to hurt someone else's case, potentially. It's interesting because I'm not sure people know, people are charged with crimes every day, right? All over the city of Toronto and elsewhere in the province and the country. And it's not like every time someone is charged, there is a press release, right? But in these cases, right, when it comes to movement activists, we very often have seen press releases in the last year and a bit, right? And like Arash mentioned, in those releases, it will often mention that the hate crime unit is involved. It might say that a hate crime is suspected, or that further charges could be laid further down the road. And many times these individuals' photos are posted online, their names, their ages, potentially even their occupation. And so what happens is not only are you arrested, and, for many people, this is the first time being arrested, trying to figure out, what do I do now? But suddenly there's this Toronto police press release and now everyone knows that you're arrested. And in the reality that we are in today, what actually happens is that lots of people get doxxed, right? They get harassed online. They get random people that do not know them, have no idea what the case is about, calling their employers, calling their families, emailing them, threatening people, or calling them, hateful names. And so there's quite a lot of harassment, unnecessary harassment that comes from just being charged at this point, as a direct result of these press releases. Meanwhile, the case eventually, gets defended and all of that stuff. And as we've seen in many cases, many of them don't actually go to even the point of trial or a plea, because it often becomes clear that there's no reasonable prospect of convicting that person, or there's no public interest.
Can I just clarify, is that the Crown looking at the case and coming to that conclusion, or does it require the pressure of legal counsel as well? Like, if, let's say, those people didn't have decent legal representation, or, not none, because we have legal aid, but, like, they just got the short end of the stick, and would they still have tried to prosecute these cases, or is it because of the efforts of legal counsel?
Look, I think what I would say is it's hard to know. Sometimes it's interesting, and I think we'll get to the hate crimes working group. Sometimes we'll have a local Crown attorney start out with a favorable position, and then they'll contacted by their colleague, another Crown attorney from the hate crimes working group, and suddenly that position has changed, and it's now something worse, right? And so it's easy. It's always to your advantage to have a lawyer who can negotiate with the Crown. Our colleagues in the legal aid system are great. They do their jobs. They only work for your case for one day, right? So their mandate is not to see your case from beginning to the end. And not all of them are also movement lawyers. So that's why I think it's helpful for folks to be turning to movement lawyers, not to say anything negative about the quality of the work of our colleagues in the legal aid system. But what I want to touch on, though, is how is the Crown actually approaching these cases, right? Because we are in a moment of increased global repression on not just Palestine, but protests generally. We've seen astronomical sentences in the UK, in the US, and we don't see that here. What we see here is a kind of uniquely Canadian paternalistic response to protest that doesn't really want to send you to jail for years, but wants you to accept that you were in the wrong, right? They want you to say, maybe you have freedom of expression, but you went too far. You took it too far either in what you said or how you said it, or you protested in a way that they didn't want you to protest. So they're demanding you to either plead guilty or to write a letter of apology or to go to classes.
Classes?
Yeah.
What kind of classes?
Re-education.
There have been Jewish comrades. There have been Jewish comrades who have been told you have to go and take a community class with a pro-Israeli Jewish group.
No, they didn't.
To understand that you have done something wrong, right? So it's couched in a form of benevolence that's actually a lot more offensive and politically demobilizing, right? And so that's
I'd rather go to jail.
And some of our clients do too. It's that tension that oftentimes people are dealing with when it comes to Crown's response to these cases. And there's this idea in the Crown's office that there's good protests and then there's bad protests, right? But it's not very clear what's good protest. What the line is arbitrary and it's ever shifting. It's obvious that protest is always going to have some level of disruption, but you got to keep that to a minimum. You shouldn't disrupt capitalism. You shouldn't disrupt property rights, and above all, you should obey the police officer when they tell you to do your protest in a different way in a different location. If you don't, you've stepped over the line, and now you have to acknowledge that. And so that's the push and pull that often involves, what's going to happen to a case. And oftentimes people don't want to give what the Crown is asking for, and then we end up, in this kind of protracted negotiations. Oftentimes, what happens at the end of the case is the case gets dropped, but it's dragged on. As Nora said, it has consequences. People lose their work. The people who are regulated professionally get professional, their regulator on their case. And it's that process that is really a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, the Gila case is an interesting one here because for most of the people who were charged in relation to the protests over the Gila Prize, the charges were eventually withdrawn. But the timing of that is interesting, right? So even the timing of when those charges were withdrawn appears to be fairly calculated by the actors in the system who have that power. So, I think it's worth noting that the charges were dropped after the next Gila Prize ceremony, right? And so essentially what that does is prevent those same protesters from protesting the Gila Prize again. So we're saying you're not allowed to go disrupt the Gila Prize, not once and certainly not twice.
As a lawyer, would be like, "Are you serious? Are you there again?"
Well, hey,
you gotta do what you gotta do. I get it, but yeah, it would.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
That's exactly what would have happened.
But it's troubling. It's very, very troubling, and it has potential far-reaching consequences when the system is getting involved to this extent in what is legitimate and not legitimate protest. Obviously, I should mention also that there is one person involved in the Gila Prize case who, for mysterious reasons, the charges have not been dropped. So, but the way that case was handled, I think tells us a lot about the priorities of the system.
That must be hard for the people who had their charges dropped to know that one of their comrades still has that hanging over them. I imagine that's the part of the point.
Very well could be, and yeah. So I imagine it must be very difficult, and I'm not aware of the exact, for example, continuing terms for that one individual who still has charges, but it might mean that they are continued to be isolated from the rest of the people who were involved, right? And so, and certainly, I'm sure there's a level of guilt associated with being able to have it acknowledged that you didn't do anything wrong, have your charges withdrawn, but then have one person left behind in a way for now.
Let's just hope, and if they do have to go to court, it strengthens the case that they couldn't find reason to convict the people with them. But that is such an awful circumstance, because I know, especially in Toronto, a lot of work has been done to create a community around the people who have been arrested, as much as possible, for resources and supports because of the stress and all of the issues that go with just having pending charges. Do you have any more examples? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if we could just let that one go by. The fact that Arash mentioned that people were being offered re-education as a means to avoid jail time.
Yeah, so I give you one example. There are a lot more examples of these kinds of re-education. I mean, in the proper context, I understand why that might make sense, right? So you need anger management if you had an outburst and punch somebody out, right? And if you can get that kind of class and then you don't have to deal with your case, that's a win-win for all. But in some of these cases, we are dealing with a warped understanding of what anti-Semitism is, and then different people who are accused of that are then told, go and learn not to be anti-Semitic, and then we'll come back and talk to me, right? And that's where there is an issue, right? And maybe this is a time to talk about, what anti-Semitism means from the Crown's perspective. And the answer is, we don't know.
That's helpful. We
tried to get clarity on that in a case, and we weren't given that information. We know that the Ontario as a province has adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which has been critiqued by many as conflating a legitimate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. We don't know to what extent that figures into how the Crown views the case, but this conflation between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism is very real. I personally had a bizarre conversation with a Crown attorney who was asking me if anti-Zionism is a form of hate. And I had to explain to them, no, Zionism is a political ideology that many Jewish people reject, right? It's not, you are anti-Zionist, that does not equate to anti-Semitism. And so that is a struggle that continues. While we don't have clarity on how the police interpret this supposedly expert hate crimes unit of the Toronto Police interprets anti-Semitism, we do know that police are getting their education and training from organizations that engage in this conflation. One particular organization was the subject of a CBC article where its own employees told CBC that that center's educators who go into primary and secondary schools are meant to report the students who voice opinions critical of Israel back to the organization, and that anything seen as critical of Israel at all, should be reported, and that the stance of the organization is that if you're not pro-Israel, then you're anti-Semitic, right? So that's the milieu we're working in.
Well, we saw it play out in court, but I guess in reverse of sorts. We talked about it just briefly on the show, where a woman had her hijab torn off at an Ottawa protest, and the person was arrested for assault, but had their charges withdrawn. And the Crown's argument there was essentially the saying of "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" was an incitement of hatred. I'm not sure what the word was, but that the accused there had reason to justification for their assault.
That specific Crown attorney who said that in court is a member of this hate crime working group, right? And maybe that's a good transition to talk about that group a little bit, if that's something you're interested in.
Oh yes, great transition.
So the hate crime working group is a group of about 24 Crown attorneys from across the province of Ontario who come together and discuss issues with respect to hate crime. And we don't know a lot of transparency about what their exact mandate is, what they're doing. But it's not unusual to have these kind of advisory groups within the Crown's office to have some kind of consistency. But what we see is that they then will confer with local Crown attorneys who have carriage of each case, and not only on cases where there is an allegation of hate motivation. Right? We've had cases of Palestine protests at all, in general, where even the police and the Crown are not saying this is hate motivated, but nonetheless, this group is involved, just like the Toronto Police's hate crimes unit is involved, to give advice about how to go about this case to the local Crown attorney. And usually what that means is good deal off the table. We're either going to trial or they have to do the X, Y, and Z, right? And so that's the group that's going on. And it's a group that, from the information that's available to us externally, appears to have a certain bias. Obviously, the example you mentioned is one of them. I might give one more example. Another person who is a member of this hate crimes working group in a court hearing was trying to justify the use of astronomical police resources to a judge to go after Palestine protesters. And he said, and I have to paraphrase because I don't have the exact wording, but he said something like, at the time, we did not know that the protests would be largely peaceful. We thought there might be a full-on breach of the public order. Right? So this is the mindset that's being brought to Palestine activism. Like, these people are out of control. It's a mob. And I think, as Nora said, it's hard to view that kind of mindset with anything other than anti-Palestinian racism. Like, why expect that the fabric of society will fall apart because people are upset about a genocide, right? And it echoes those early tweets we got after October 7th, where the chief of police in Toronto, and virtually every police force in Canada, or at least Ontario, on that day said not only that they were monitoring the events in Israel, but that they were not aware of any threats to Jewish communities, right? And you would think, well, if you're not aware, why do you have to say it 100 times that you're not aware of any threat?
Even the mayor said it.
Even the mayor said it.
Even the mayor echoed that, like on October 8th or 9th. That was very upsetting. No. These people were gathered for very specific purpose. I imagine they were vetted. This wasn't some lot where they just randomly picked 24. You would have to imagine these folks believe that what they're doing is justified at some point, which means like they're starting from a certain mindset. I think any kind of dissenting voice wouldn't be around very long. I want to go back just a little point of clarification. You said it wasn't unusual for groups like working groups to exist within the Attorney General's office. Can you give me another example of another time they want to make sure they're all on the same page?
Yeah, so there is the sexual violence working group, for example. I forget the exact title of the working group, but it has existed for a while, and it does address that issue.
Well, they don't. they don't. They're not, for the record.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I have my other criticism of that group. One of them is that I mean, maybe this is kind of off topic, and maybe you will cut it eventually. But I want to say it because they have said that even the complainants of sexual assault who want to have restorative justice, we're not going to give it to them because they don't recognize how bad sexual violence that they have experienced is, and restorative justice is not appropriate for that.
But it's interesting that those groups are comparable because they're not. Like, you're talking about a group that is mandated to examining sexual assault and sexual crimes like that, and protests related to the Middle East. Like, right? There's not a similarity there other than they both have massive amounts of resources being spent in the Attorney General's office of folks trying to crack down on protests related to the Middle East. Like, that is a clear mandate. You say we don't know it, but we know parts of it, right? Like, that it's broad, that even if we were started talking about Syria or anywhere in the Middle East, like that is, are we going to get that same approach? And how far of a stretch is it before they just expand that, where it's just like any protest, any disruption, forget the Middle East, or they can have their own racist working group, but then we're just going to have this ultra fash one. They can work it separately and go after climate, and they already go after indigenous disruptors or protesters or whatnot. So, good grief. So they all get together. Can I assume that you folks get together to try to figure out how to deal with this? Does anybody try to dismantle this hate crimes unit? Like, it feels really wrong. Like, you were the folks with the legal jargon to explain that, but to me, it feels incredibly wrong. And I think Nora's language is like, we could call this racist. Like, no, it's kind of like explicitly racist, right? Like, I think, is there work being done to dismantle it, or are you folks just having to navigate it?
So I have recently seen organizing groups put out requests to, various political channels saying, we're aware of this hate crime working group. In fact, we've heard of these recent incidents that make us very concerned. For example, the Ottawa case that was withdrawn related to the person who pulled off a woman's hijab, and say, can someone look into this? Can someone explain to us what is going on? And is this condoned by our system, by our politicians? Like, what is going on? So I think efforts are being made, but it is very challenging when it's so opaque, right? We don't necessarily know exactly how the hate crime working group works. We don't exactly know what their goals are, where they get their marching orders from, what those even are. And so it's very difficult to try to actually deal with something that is acting like this cloud. It's a cloud that you're trying to catch, but it's just so gaseous, right? Like, it's just, it has no solid form to us, right? To us, it looks like an almost at a distance, there's this overseeing group. And so, and I can say, I mean, there are efforts to see if the involvement of the hate crime working group, like the extent of that in specific cases, whether that can be addressed through the court system. So far, there hasn't been any success with that.
I mean, kind of proving political interference at some level?
Exactly, because I do think, you mentioned Project Resolute early on, and I think I do want to be clear, like, yet I try to use careful language when I can, right? Obviously, that's like the bane of being a lawyer sometimes is you
lawyers and politicians.
Yes, you need to add all the caveats, right? But I do think it's fair to say that this process, we suspect, is highly politicized, right? It's a highly politicized process. And, we didn't touch on it directly earlier, but I think it's worth mentioning. I mean, we know that the Toronto police is trained by Israeli police and Israeli military, right? They use Israeli tech. A few days after October 7 in 2023, when the genocide against the Palestinians had already began, we had this statement issued by, I forget what they're called, but it's essentially like the overarching larger group of all the police forces in Ontario. They issued a statement explicitly saying we recognize the right of Israel to defend itself, right? There's no mention of civilian casualties, no mention of the attacks on Palestinians that had started to unfold. And so that's the starting point that our police system has when it comes to these individuals, is we assert the right of this foreign country to defend itself.
At all costs, too. I mean, we often get window dressing statements, right? Like, we'll just issue a statement and it doesn't mean anything, like our food emergency and a homelessness emergency. We're in it, but we're just going to acknowledge it. But, like, they back it up. They back that statement up with, like, a lot of politically damaging moves. I think, I might get it wrong. I think it was the Maple that was on the show, and they had covered a story, I think, pre-October 7th at the Israeli embassy, and red paint, and whatever. The back and forth was, eventually it came out that the Crown was talking directly to people within the embassy, and that was how they secured a witness. And it was just became obvious that there was contact there, because I know you don't know where they're getting their marching orders, and everyone has their own idea of who is manipulating whom. But incredibly frustrating. But I think obviously the defense of Israel's apartheid is one of the goals, right? Explicit. Why it's one of their goals, we can all argue about, but defending that position has become so clearly the goal of so many politicians. I asked the question about pushing back as well, because we are in an election period, right? And I would love to be able to hear from, I would say, the NDP, I don't know, anybody on the campaign trail at this point, that they would end Project Resolute. Like, from what I've heard, and then knowing the work that my comrades do, my vote would be dependent on somebody taking a stand on how this Attorney General's office is being managed. Probably before this, I imagine, like, you guys have horror stories that date, but this is next level. And Project Resolute, not only because of the police spending that it ends up being on municipalities and whatnot, but just the denial of our legal rights, and just the manipulation and the exhaustion level that this must have. Like, there's a million things these folks could be doing, and you folks could be doing, than defending against charges that were never meant to be laid.
The one thing I want to say, Jessa, is to that point. Like, we part of being a movement lawyer is to understand the limits of what you do and what actually the movement has to do, and what an organized public has to do, right? So pushing back against something like Project Resolute is something that the community is doing and should be doing, and it's their proper role. And it's beautiful to see the solidarity that exists in our communities in the face of this repression. They haven't slowed down in their protests. We have seen people come together to support each other. And one of the ways that has happened is through the Toronto Community Justice Fund. And that's a fund that is created in the aftermath of these arrests to support all community members who are facing legal and other financial repercussions stemming from their criminalization that they're experiencing. So I recommend your listeners to go to the Toronto Community Justice Fund, make a donation, because while having these charges are scary and difficult, but when we organize together, we are stronger than the state.
Just making a note here. My audience should know by now that you go to the show notes for the links of all the things that folks are mentioning. And yes, the Toronto Community Justice Fund will be one of them. This is not the first time they've heard about the good work that's happening there. Do you know of other cities that are as organized as Toronto when it comes to the community that exists from police arrests? I teased the folks that we had people on from the community support group. If we wondered if the cops knew the families they were creating, like if you thought we were tight before, I mean, watching these people come together post arrest, having the opposite effect that the people involved, right? The Crown and the police want you to be divided and isolated and scared, and they might feel all these things at times, but yeah, the work that's being done to alleviate those harms so that folks can kind of fearlessly keep doing this work, right? Because these arrests will still keep happening. But I'm wondering if you know other cities that are starting to mobilize in this way and kind of catch up in terms of how to respond legally.
I think so. I mean, I think Toronto has gone really far along on that road, and I think the people involved in the legal support committee here are doing exceptional work that I don't know if it has actually been fully replicated elsewhere. But what I do know is that I've definitely seen beautiful solidarity and community in New Brunswick, in Quebec, in British Columbia, in Ottawa, in different cities. And people are not, I think people are trying their best to not leave anyone behind and not have anyone feel like they're alone in this process. So I've been incredibly impressed. And I think Toronto has an amazing organizing community, and it's even more impressive in a way to see it happening in places where maybe they didn't have the similar infrastructure from before, right? But they're building it from the ground up.
I'm going to bug you and ask you to put me in touch with any of those folks if you can, because I really get excited when you hear from the smaller places, because that tells you that folks can do this starting from nothing and build up. But, they got to see examples and share victories. And hopefully that's what we do here. And I'm wondering, I say there's no precedent for this, but is there? You studied, I'm going to say you studied movement law, but I mean, you had a seminar course, but you've done it for so long, surely, and you say there's writings on it. Have we been in this spot before?
I think the scale is to some extent unprecedented. I think to have a movement that persists for as long as it has, and the amount of repression it has faced, and it still continues to go, that's what's unprecedented. Definitely, a concerted effort to stifle organizing is nothing new. That has existed, and the community has responded. I know I mentioned the Movement Defense Committee. One of the big things it was in its history was the support of people in for the G20 protests. That was a huge police operation and massive rights violation in Toronto. So we've dealt with, but that was one incident, right? That was just the G20 conference and the surrounding events, not more than a year's long a campaign. So that's something that's historic about this moment.
I love that answer because sometimes you lose sight of it, right? When we're talking about the suppression and whatnot, the resilience is the opposite end of that. It's still there, and they're having to increase these tactics because people have not been deterred, because they're so courageous and determined, and there's nothing that will stop them. So I'm glad there's folks like you trying to figure out the legal side of it, because it's not something we can avoid. And it is perhaps what will deter people as the police state continues to build up, or not, right? Or we can dismantle it. But, in the meantime, I think just knowing that movement lawyers exist, that there's different ways to approach this, and unraveling it all perhaps helps people get out there and not be deterred, because that is the whole point. But yeah, like you said, Arash, there's really no deterring. If we couldn't do it with this, that, and the other thing, mind you, Polyev seems to have a few tricks up his sleeve. He said yesterday that he is open to deporting people accused of hate-related activities. And Trump has also signed an executive order to deport people for supporting Hamas and Hezbollah. So that could be a new twist. You would have to then start working with immigration lawyers, I imagine, and would have a whole new set of comrades to include in the circle of what we do against this kind of suppression, both. But thank you so much for taking time to come on here. You folks have your hands full. I can't imagine the workload that is in front of you right now. So just the fact that you came to spend an hour with us to unpack it all, I'm very grateful. And for the work that you do for the movement. It's invaluable. Like, history will remember you for this.
You're too kind, Jessa. Thank you so much for having us.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content. And if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.